So we're very happy, Remy and I, to welcome you today. So for this template webinar on Plurilingual CALL, and we're the Belgian team, so from UC Louvain, and welcome to everyone for joining. So as you can see, this is, the website. So this is the website of the template project, the general website, and you see the names of all our, not the names on the website, but the list of all the teams who are taking part in the project. And this is the open website, so you can also browse the website to know more about the project. So the outline of the presentation, sorry, I've got a problem with my, oops. Yeah, the outline of the presentation today for the 30 minutes of webinar for content presentation will be organized as follows. So as you could probably discover from the links we sent you and from browsing the modules, there are four different approaches when it comes to plurilingual education. So I'm not going to read them, but what we'll do is that for each, we'll be briefly recapping what it is, but we will present new examples, so not those that you could see if you checked the website, but new examples. And please make sure when you hear those examples, if you can take some notes, things that you find potentially okay or not okay, or that you find interesting, or comments you might have, please don't hesitate to take some notes or ideas that come to you when we're presenting, because they might be useful when we do the discussions in the breakout room. So let's start. Introduction. So 4 main approaches, as you could see on the previous slide. And the general definition that we could give for plurilingual approaches is basically all the didactic approaches that include the use of activities involving more than one variety of language or languages or cultures. And something that may be interesting to add is a terminological comment. So a terminological distinction is often mainly made in Europe between multilingualism and plurilingualism, less so in other areas. So for instance, in the States, they only speak of multilingualism to include the two aspects. But I think the distinction that is made in Europe is interesting, because multilingualism is defined as basically the coexistence of different languages at the social or individual level. And they use the term plurilingualism when it comes to actually using in a dynamic way the linguistic repertoire of an individual user or learner. So it's the active use of the different types of languages that you know. So that's just a terminological point. And then perhaps to visualize things. Sorry, I've got a problem with my mouse, which is very slow. Okay, I'll do that. I think this is something that people usually remember pretty well. And the plurilingual approaches are really a move from what we could call a silo approach. That means you learn a language, and the language is on this side, and then you learn another language, and it's the second one, and it's in the middle, and then you learn a third language as it's on the right-hand side. And it's all clean and neat and separated. So that's basically how languages were taught in the past, focus on one language or another one or another one. And basically what we're seeing now is that we have, plurilingual approaches means that all the languages are interconnected. And it's more in line with how a multilingual brain functions, because you cannot switch on and off a language, but everything is connected and helps acquiring and using other languages. And as you can see, all the silos are not the same shape. Some are more connected than others, but that's basically an image that you can keep in mind to represent the plurilingual approaches. So let's start with the first one. So the first one, not in any particular order, that's how we organized it here, is Awakening to Languages. And as a reminder, Awakening to Languages, what is the main principle? The main principle is that you can use any language in the world that is or could be learned. So it may seem a bit like almost impossible, because you could say, oh, well, no, I don't know all the language. Of course, we don't know all the languages as teachers, but that's the idea. And that's probably the most extreme approach, is any language is useful. And why is it useful? To increase positive attitudes towards all those languages, and say that each language is, I mean, all languages are equal, and there are, of course, differences and similarities, but they're all important. So let's look at one example of activity. And we have decided here to introduce multilingual storytelling for kids. So this is something you can do with kids. And you see here at the bottom of the slide, you will have access to the slides later on. We will send you the slides. You have a link to this whole project, which contains all sorts of little books like that that might be useful for teachers. So here we have a book which is called Arthur and Anthony, or Arturo e Antonio, sorry for my pronunciation, or Arthur et... où est-ce qu'il est le français? Arthur et Anton ou Anthony, je ne sais pas. And what you see here is that those little books, so you've got, of course, it's a picture book for kids, and you see that you can buy those books in bilingual versions. So you can either have German Arabic or German Italian, German Spanish, etc., etc. And you have comments. So the story is told in two languages. This is the website for the editor, and you also have access to someone reading the story in one language and in the other language. So you have those bilingual versions. And so this is very useful to use with kids. And of course, you can also keep the images and ask someone else to read the story in another language that is not available. So it's a multi-purpose resource. And it's interesting because with such books, I mean, using multilingual books, invite children to read, hear, look at, listen to stories in different languages. The idea is not so much to learn new languages, but to hear new sounds, to make meanings, to see that if they read the story in a language that they know, then they can hear it in another language, but they recognize the pictures. You can also invite the parents, some of the parents, to read the same story in another language. It's also nice because they see that we can use their own languages and say that, you know, all languages are equal. And we make meaning by using a whole set of languages. We build bridges between languages and cultures, and we discover the joys of, having nice plurilingual moments in the school community. So when you see all this, maybe just start thinking about things that you could do to use those books in multilingual, those plurilingual books or multilingual books in your own school community. Do you do that already? Is that something that you could use? And of course, we don't have time to present everything, but this is just the key ideas. Okay, so this is the example we wanted to introduce for Awakening to Languages. Now we're going to the second approach, which is called the integrated didactic approach. And here, the key difference between this one and the previous one is that here we help learners establish links between a limited number of languages and the languages that are taught within the school curriculum. So in the integrated didactic approach, it's not just any language, but the languages that are taught in the school curriculum. Why is it important? Because working with those languages, remember the connected silos, when you've learned two languages already, there are quite many things you already know and strategies and stuff that you can reuse, and words and similarities between languages, and learning options that you've already acquired. The fact is that you can capitalize on what you already know, or the learners can capitalize on what they already know, to access what is less known. So it could, for instance, be using the language of schooling for accessing the first foreign language, which in turn is used as a springboard to facilitate the acquisition of a second foreign language, etc., etc. And what is also important to remember is that in the past, we saw transfer as from L1 to L2, but not so much from L2 to L1 or from L3 to L2. But current research has shown that the support between languages is really multi-directional. So it's not only L1 influencing other languages, but L3 can influence L2, and even strategies that you learn in an L3, so a third language, can be reinvested even in your mother tongue. So here we'll be looking at some examples. My slide says 3, but I'm not sure I put 3, but let's have a look at the examples of possible activity types. So you have project-based learning types of activities that you can use. So what is the role of the teachers when you go for a project-based approach is basically to identify the opportunities that your students might have to use their linguistic repertoire in new and creative ways in the classroom or the virtual classroom if you do things online for digital project-based output. I use digital here because template is also trying to recommend the use of technology and show what technology can do to help teachers and learners. But it could also, of course, be without technology, but our focus is also on technology. So I've added it here. So what is the learner's role? Well, the learner's roles could be do things like create multilingual graphics, posters, or collage, or websites, or write a blog post, which is multilingual, or animated video to present their school learning or their learning context, or to focus on specific school projects that they might have. Of course, it's just ideas. I'm not going to give you examples for each. But the idea is to say we're doing something together, we're putting all our resources together, we're working in teams, and we're trying to use the languages that we know to produce something useful for the school, for us, in our own environment. And I've also put some examples, but it's just examples that I will not comment. So you have things that are, not so technological, but it's just a collage with languages and different words. They can create graphics in different languages that they put in the schools to welcome people or to say thanks for whatever option or activity that they've done. You can also use, they're becoming more common now, these bilingual songs. So for instance, here it's a French-English bilingual song, and you've got bilingual lyrics that you can use for school fairs or anything if they want to sing. And so you've got all sorts of things that you can do with them in types of activities where they can show their linguistic potential to the rest of the group. Then another one is what we call text mediation activities. And this is something which is not new, but becoming more common, but still not very often used. So for instance, mediation competences are part of the companion volume to the Common European Framework for Languages. And what is this mediation competence? Well, it's when the user or the learner acts as a social agent to create bridges and to help construct or convey meaning from one language to another. Okay, so you've got different types of mediation activities, and I will focus on one here. This is mediating a text, and the idea is to pass on to another person the content of a text to which they do not have access, be it for linguistic, cultural, semantic, or technical barriers. And you do that here with text in different languages. So my example, so I'm not going to read the text, but you can, for instance, prepare a lecture on sustainable tourism in your language course. And you can start with a warm-up activity, which would be a quiz in English, for instance. Then you have a reading activity with 2 texts. So if I've taken our situation here in Belgium, some students, pupils at school study English and Dutch and German. So they have the 3 languages. So you could start with English, then have input text in Dutch and German. And then what you can do is have a task that they have to carry out in English, which could be of the following type. So, for instance, they have to read the text, which are in German and Dutch, and write in English this time a list of challenges and possible solutions that they have identified in the text. And it's important for the teacher to tell your pupils something like, even if you don't understand all the words, your current knowledge and the related courses you're attending at school. So remember here, it's integrated approach, so it's the languages taught at school. All this should help you identify key ideas from the text, even if you don't understand everything. And you can also make it group work-like and make it a bit fun. So for instance, they can work in groups of 3. That's just a suggestion, of course, to produce the list of challenges and solutions that they can identify from the text. And you can make it slightly game-like and use more technology by telling them that they have 3 translation vouchers per group that they can exchange with the group leader who has access to DeepL. So perhaps they can translate three short sections to help the team. And you integrate technology, you merge all the languages that they know, and their brain has to be active, reading and translating and mediating from one language to the next. And of course, all this, as is the case for the other activities presenting, comes with follow-up tasks of any type that you might want to do in one language, in the other language, to exploit all the things you've done with them. Okay, so I've presented two options, and now I'll hand over to Remy, who will talk about the other 2 approaches. And I'll stop sharing my screen in a minute.
So the third approach to plurilingualism is the intercultural approach. So the goal of language learning is communication. So we want people to understand other people who use the same language. But sometimes you have people with similar cultural backgrounds and other people with different cultural backgrounds. If you share the same cultural background, you'll have some differences, but you'll have some commonalities, some similarities. But if you don't have the same cultural backgrounds, then you will have a lot of differences probably, and few commonalities. So the idea of the intercultural approach is to teach learners how to spot these commonalities and differences and capitalize on them to facilitate communication. So we have some examples of differences in commonalities. So for instance, etiquette, appropriateness, showing emotions, thanking, greeting, and so on. So you want to facilitate communication. So it's using phenomena from one or more cultures to promote reflection about contact situations involving people with different cultural backgrounds. So let's take a look at an example of activity. This is a text which is called Emotions Around the World, from Stoicism to Heart on Sleeve and everything in between. So this is the text. You have an introduction, you have testimonies from around the world, and you have a conclusion. So the first activity could consist in asking the learners, okay, read the title and subtitle of the article and look at the pictures, discuss with your partner what you think the article is about, and they can look up definitions of words that they don't understand on the internet. Then they read the introduction of the text and they check their assumptions. So they try to guess the content of the text. Here, they check by reading the introduction. And then you can have an activity online with a Mentimeter, and you ask your learners to click on the feature that matches their personality. So for instance, if they're stoic or they sometimes show their emotions, or it depends on the situation. And then they can submit it, and you can show the results to your learners to see what type of learners you have in the classroom in general. That's the first activity. So the second activity would be to look at the second section of the article, and before reading further, they look at the profiles of the people who give their testimonies. And they have to put them in either the Stoic box in between or Heart on Sleeve based on the information that they have at this stage. And then they read their testimonies and they try to check if they guessed right. So here it's the idea of confronting them with their stereotypes and preconceived ideas about people. And then they read the text, like I said, and they check. Then you have a vocabulary exercise where you list the expressions that are used to talk about the fact that people are stoic or that they have their heart on their sleeves. The next activity is to describe how they manage their emotions themselves. They have to talk as well about the people in their city, their country, their town, and their friends. And finally, discuss what they've learned today. So they discovered that people with different cultural backgrounds may express their emotions differently. What does that mean for me, and what should I pay attention to in my future interactions? Because you want to raise awareness to the fact that people express their emotions differently across the world. And the final approach is the intercomprehension approach. So the idea is that if you if you know a language, you can use that language to understand other languages that are related to that one. So here you have, this is my house, which is a language I speak, it's English. Dat is mijn huis, it's another language that I speak. So if I can speak those two languages, and even if I can speak one of these two languages, I can understand the third one in German, even though it's a language I don't speak. So it's the idea that you can capitalize on your own languages or language to understand other languages. And it's an alternative or complement to the use of an international language such as English to communicate. So here is an example of another activity about Copenhagen. So you have three texts that are written in three different Germanic languages. And the idea is to raise the learner's awareness to similarities between the languages. So you can ask them to try and find how they say the following words in Dutch and in Danish. So city, tour, guide, street, history, culture, perspective. And you notice that some words are very similar, some words are not, but you can see some links between the three languages that are used. And you can also ask the learners, how do you say these words in your first language so that they can compare as well. Then there's another activity where a fourth text was created in Swedish, and you can compare Swedish and Danish, and you see that many words are similar in those two languages. So you show that Germanic languages share similarities, but some languages are closer than the others. And that's it for the four approaches.